At 2:37 p.m. on June 6, 1944, Sergeant James Jimmy McKnight was crouched behind a destroyed stone wall in Normandy, watching 18 German Panzers advance in perfect formation through a wheat field. It was another impossible mission. The German tanks were too heavily armored, too fast, and American bazookas barely scratched their frontal armor. The chances of survival were practically zero. To destroy a Panzer IV with conventional weaponry, Allied infantry needed an average of 8 to 12 direct hits on the armor's weak points. Most soldiers died before landing a single successful hit. The Germans knew this. Their commanders had studied American tactics and knew every limitation of Allied anti-tank artillery, openly mocking it. But that afternoon, something different was being carried on McKnight's shoulder. It was something German engineers considered technically impossible. Something a Wehrmacht general, hearing the rumors, would have called an American fantasy, a radio-guided flying bomb. McKnight pulled the trigger. 3 shots. The first missile missed by meters, but the second exploded just 15 meters from the lead Panzer, as a direct impact was no longer necessary. The German tank exploded in the middle of the field. What happened over the next 4 hours would change the war in Europe forever and lead to the destruction of 18 Panzers that never saw the attack coming, because the technology protecting them had become obsolete in minutes. The design of that weapon had begun in 1942, addressing the problem that conventional rockets only detonated on direct impact or at a predetermined time, making both methods useless against moving armored targets. The theoretical solution was simple: make the projectile detect when it was close to the target and explode automatically. The problem was that this required placing a radio guidance system inside a portable rocket. The initial response from the National Defense Research Committee was unanimous: impossible. A guided missile would need a transmitter, receiver, gyroscopes, and a functional warhead, all in a package a soldier could carry. Furthermore, the device would have to withstand launch, fly at high speeds, and maintain enough stability to hit a moving target. But Dr. Charles Stark Draper of MIT would not accept impossible. His team worked for 18 months in absolute secrecy, creating miniaturized gyroscopes, flight control systems, and revolutionary-shaped warheads. The result was called the remote-controlled bazooka in official documents, but soldiers nicknamed it the cigarette box because of its rectangular shape. The device weighed only 16 kilograms and worked by emitting radio signals that, when reflected back by a nearby metal object like a tank, triggered the detonator. In March 1944, the Aberdeen Proving Ground tested the new weapon against moving targets in the Nevada desert. 5 obsolete tanks, 7 shots, 5 destructions. The Army canceled the rest of the tests and began mass production immediately. But there was a critical problem: absolute secrecy. If a remote-controlled missile fell into enemy hands, Nazi engineers could replicate it or develop countermeasures. The decision was clear. The cigarette boxes would only be used in operations where recovery by the enemy was impossible or where the element of surprise was so devastating that it didn't matter. Colonel Thompson personally escorted the first 2,000 units to England in April 1944, and General Bradley distributed the ammunition to 3 divisions operating near the Normandy beaches, including the 29th Infantry Division. The 29th had been brutally attacked over the previous 3 months, firing more than 8,000 conventional rockets and destroying only 6 tanks, a rate of 1,333 shots per kill. On June 5, 1944, the division received 300 special missiles, and the crew was trained in absolute secrecy. The cigarette boxes were marked only as Type 7 ammunition. On the morning of June 6, D-Day, the 29th Division landed on Omaha Beach under heavy German fire. By 2 p.m., after hours of bloody combat, German armored units were spotted approaching the American position. 18 Panzer IVs and 3 Tigers emerged from the hills. One of them destroyed an American Sherman with a single shot. The German tanks advanced to 1,200 meters, outside the effective range of conventional artillery, but Sergeant McKnight had orders to test the new ammunition. 3 shots in 6 seconds. The first missile exploded near a barn, and the second detonated 15 meters from one of the Panzers. The explosion scattered hundreds of shrapnel fragments in every direction, and the German tank caught fire and exploded. The third shot exploded near another Panzer, severely damaging its tracks. 2 destructions with 3 shots. The 29th's crew was stunned, and the official artillery report stated, "The value of the Type 7 missile cannot be overstated." During the first months after D-Day, the Germans began to realize something had changed. Tank veterans reported inexplicable experiences of Panzers being destroyed by airbursts without direct impact. Commander Otto Carius, one of Germany's greatest tank aces, reported that American projectiles were now exploding near his Panzer even when they didn't hit, as if they knew where we were. German military intelligence tried to figure out what was happening but considered it impossible to put a functional radio system inside a portable rocket. A July 1944 German naval intelligence report stated, "Rumors among American prisoners suggest a new type of ammunition. The descriptions are technically implausible, likely disinformation or exaggeration." General Heinz Guderian reportedly commented sarcastically that if the Americans were putting radios inside portable rockets, they might as well put entire factories inside every soldier. But by the end of 1944, 57 different American companies in 83 factories were producing 15,000 cigarette boxes per day. In July 1944, the cigarette box found its ideal target, the German Tiger Panzers. These heavy tanks were the primary German weapon against Allied infantry, advancing slowly but unstoppably. With conventional rockets, reaction time and error margin were critical, but with the cigarette boxes, the margin of error didn't matter because the missile exploded when it was near the tank. Military historian Stephen Ambrose described an attack during Operation Cobra. The field flickered with rocket flashes, smoking turrets and bright fireballs on the horizon attested to the precision of the anti-tank artillery and the efficiency of the super-secret Type 7 ammunition. 9 of the 15 attacking Tigers were destroyed, and an Allied armored column was saved. Throughout 1944, the cigarette box was responsible for 60% of tank kills, even though it represented only 20% of the ammunition used. With an efficiency rate 400% higher than conventional ammunition, the confidence of German tank commanders in their tactics was rapidly disintegrating. At 3:17 a.m. on September 17, 1944, the 29th Infantry Division opened fire on a German armored column near Arnhem. The 29th were veterans of the cigarette boxes. But that night, the battle would be fought in open terrain. Their rate of fire was devastating, 12 missiles per minute. In 21 minutes, 8 German Panzers were torn apart. But the 29th had exhausted its special ammunition and was using conventional rockets, which failed constantly, making the unit a perfect target. 3 German Flak 88 guns opened fire on the American position. 23 soldiers died immediately. More than 200 survivors were trapped behind enemy lines, hiding for 6 days in abandoned farms until they were finally rescued by a special reconnaissance operation. The 29th had been the first division to use cigarette boxes in combat. Now their men were buried in military cemeteries scattered across France. Between June 1944 and the end of the war, the cigarette box fundamentally changed the balance of power in Europe. Against Panzer tank attacks, proximity-guided missiles required only 42 shots per kill, while conventional ammunition needed 800. During the Battle of the Bulge, the 101st Airborne Division destroyed 53 German tanks in 2 days using cigarette boxes. General Dwight Eisenhower wrote that the new missile was devastating and that a new method of armored warfare will need to be created. By the end of the war, more than 8 million cigarette boxes had been produced. The Germans, who mocked the remote-controlled rocket, never managed to develop an equivalent technology and paid for it with the loss of hundreds of tanks and, ultimately, the war itself. Colonel Thompson, who had escorted the first missiles to Europe, moved on to his next project, captured V-2 rockets. Sergeant James McKnight, the first to test the technology impossible, survived the war and became a physics professor in Ohio. His story of the 4 minutes that changed the war was never forgotten. The cigarette box democratized anti-tank warfare. Soldiers who once fled at the sound of a Panzer's tracks now held their ground and waited. They knew they had a chance. And this psychological shift was as devastating as the weapon itself. German commanders began avoiding direct confrontations with American infantry, something unthinkable at the start of the war. In October 1944, captured documents revealed that the Wehrmacht had issued an order, avoid close engagement with American infantry units equipped with new intermediate-range anti-tank weaponry. It was an implicit admission that German armored superiority had ended. But the legacy of the cigarette box went beyond World War II. The proximity technology developed for that missile formed the basis for modern guided missiles, air defense systems, and even automotive airbag technology. The principle of detecting proximity and reacting automatically revolutionized not just warfare, but civilian safety. In 1947, the project files were partially declassified. It was discovered that the true name of the project was Operation Checkmate. A fitting name for a weapon that ended the Panzer's dominance in Europe. The engineers who worked on the project received the Presidential Medal of Merit, but their names remained classified for another 30 years. Dr. Charles Stark Draper continued his career developing inertial navigation systems that would later be used in the Apollo missions to the moon. When asked about the cigarette box, he said, "We didn't just invent a weapon. We invented the idea that electronics could think faster than a human in combat." And he was right. The cigarette box was the first step toward modern drones and smart missiles. It was the moment when war stopped being just about brute force and became about primitive artificial intelligence. Veterans of the 29th Division rarely spoke about the cigarette box after the war. Many carried the weight of knowing they had used a secret technology that killed hundreds of German soldiers who never had a chance to react. It was an unfair advantage, some said. But it was war. And in war, superior technology saves lives on your side. In 1984, a memorial ceremony was held in Normandy. A former Panzer commander, now in his 70s, approached an American veteran and asked, "How did you make those rockets explode without hitting?" The American smiled and replied, "You never knew about the cigarette boxes, did you?" The German shook his head. "We never heard of it. We just thought you had better artillery." That was the final irony. The most revolutionary weapon of the ground war in Europe was so secret that even the enemy didn't know it existed. They only knew they were losing. Today, replicas of the cigarette boxes are on display at the National World War II Museum in New Orleans and the Imperial War Museum in London. The era of massive tank confrontations was ending. The era of guided precision was beginning. And it all started with a sergeant at a stone wall in Normandy, holding something his enemies called impossible, in which he called only a cigarette box. For minutes later, 18 Panzers had disappeared. And war would never be the same again.